Hello, hello, dear listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here with my wonderful co-host, Marie Mayhew. Marie, how you doing?
I am doing really good, man. What's going on? What's the story? What's the haps?
Nothing much. You know, we have a couple of big announcements this episode. We're just going to jump right into them. First off, we are on Conflict Radio Official, their YouTube channel now. If you would like to listen to the podcast through YouTube, or if you have someone that likes, might like the content but doesn't really use podcast apps or listens on YouTube, you can go check it out. Gotten some really great feedback from the YouTube comment sections. Got one here I'm going to read. Jake, you're going to have to bleep this out a little bit. It says, blah, 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 blah. Shut the up already. Please just do the show and stop all the plugging, fat boy. It is my favorite comment I have ever gotten on anything I've ever done.
I think that's going on a button or a sticker or something, man. Stop the plug-in, fat boy.
Stop the plug-in, fat boy. It's so good. It just cuts to the core, Marie.
I love it.
Anyways, dear listeners.
Yeah. You know what? And you know what? More power to you. You don't like what we're saying. You think I say too much. I love that stuff.
How did you know?
Because it's like, I feel like I read it and I'm just like, I kind of crack up. It's like, I love that stuff.
How did he know I was fat?
I don't know.
How did he know? Anyways, today's episode, we're talking about Marijuana Myths Part 2.
Is there any other, was really quick before we go too far down the rabbit hole, was there any other announcements besides people hating up on us?
We do have some really cool stuff. So this episode, actually, we just wanted to give a quick plug and shout out to one of my favorite podcasts, the Breaking Math Podcast. It's run by a bunch of really, really smart folks. They are trained mathematicians and computer scientists, and, they just talk about such fascinating topics in a way that I think really brings mathematics to people that may not like it already. Right? So if you liked math in some ways in school, or are fascinated by mathematics and how it applies to, the world and physics and computers and everything else, but didn't really have a good experience with math in school, I think the Breaking Math Podcast is going to be for you. It is phenomenal. One of my favorites. Go check it out. That's breakingmathpodcast.com. And you can also just check them out on all your listening devices.
Nice plug, fat boy.
Thanks, Marie. Anyways, so roll the thing. I can't even do it right anymore. Roll the thing, Jake.
Welcome to the Mad Scientist Podcast. This week's episode: Weed, Pot, the Devil's Lettuce, 420 Blizzard.
Oh my goodness. Anyways, all right. So today's episode is Marijuana Myths Part 2. So we talked earlier in the previous episode about kind of the history.
My dad getting high.
Right. We did talk about Marie's dad getting high a little bit. We talked a little bit about kind of the history of marijuana. It's kind of the background on how it's been kind of marketed as this terrible, terrifying thing to parents. And, it's going to turn your kids into sex-crazed fiends and all this other stuff. And
Reefer madness.
Right, reefer madness and all of that. But on the same time, the scales have really shifted significantly in recent years. Right? So, I would say when I was a kid, it was still super taboo, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
And actually, you can look here. This is from Pew Research. This is public polling on marijuana. So the first one here is, should marijuana... So the question was, do you think the use of marijuana should be made legal or not in percentage? In 1969, 84% said it should be illegal. 12% said it should be legal. And that has basically, in the 80s, right around 1980, there was actually quite a shift. It was from So it went from 84 in 69 to 66 that said it should be illegal in 1980. So quite something of a big swing. And then in the middle of the 80s towards the 1990s, we had the drug war. We had, this is your brain on drugs, all that stuff.
Just say no.
Right. Just
Thank
say
you, Nancy
no.
Reagan.
And it jumped back up to 81% in 1990 on it should be illegal. But we then, since that time, have seen it almost linearly decreasing. So it was 81% for it being illegal in 1990. Today, or in 2017, I should say, the amount of people who thought it should be illegal was 37%. So there is more widespread support for the legalization of marijuana than almost any other thing in American political life. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, well,
and
that is also because if every single state was to legalize it and tax it as a regular, fully legal, taxed in all 50 states, guess how much federal tax revenue they'd be generating between like a 6-year span, a 5-6 year span.
I mean, I would wager in the hundreds of billions.
$131.8 billion.
Yep. I mean, that makes total sense. Now,
in taxed revenue. I mean, that's no chump change. I don't care where you're from.
There's also a significant difference though. Again, this is from Pew Research in the kind of the partisan gap, I guess is what they're calling it here, in whether or not it should be legal or illegal. So more men think it should be legal than women. 64% of men to 57% of women. Mm-hmm. In terms of the demographics, like the racial demographics, it's actually quite interesting. 62% of white respondents said it should be legal. 71% of black respondents said it should be legal. Only 52% of Hispanic respondents said it should be legalized. I think that has something to do with, honestly, I mean, I at least have seen this in my own life through friends and stuff, that the Hispanic community actually tends to be, I mean, it depends, of course, like with any community, but tends to be more religious, more conservative in that sense. More, I guess traditional is more the right word. Then if we look at, if you have a high school degree or less, 54% think it should be legalized. Some college, 65%, and a college graduate plus 65%. So again, kind of the higher level education, the more likely you are to think that it should be legalized. But that swing isn't really, it's not a huge swing. It's a 10-point swing. And then in terms of your political leanings, if you're a Republican, 43% say it should be legal. Democrat, 69%. Independent, 65%. So, again, it does seem to skew with kind of more conservative religious, say, upbringing. And then actually, if you look at religious upbringing, or how people, I guess, what category people would put themselves in, white evangelical Protestants said 38% say it should be legal. White mainline Protestants, 64% say it should be legal. Catholic, 52% say it should be legal. And unaffiliated, 78% of unaffiliated Americans think it should be legal. So it's
Catholic is a pretty even split. That's pretty amazing. 52%.
It's interesting actually. And that to me is very interesting, because growing up Catholic, right? I mean, you drink wine at mass, right? Like it's
that's the blood of Christ. That doesn't count.
Yeah, but I mean, there are chapters in the Bible that discuss the use of hemp, and specifically there's a chapter in Genesis. Actually, I was listening to a podcast that was suggested to us, I think, by one of the hosts on Twitter. Just pulling up the name here. The show is called Doc and the Deacon. It's a relatively new show, and on that show there is a deacon, right? And he was saying something very interesting that actually I had heard before, which was that actually in the Bible there's a section in Genesis where God, basically it says that God created all the plants of the earth and they were good, right?
Lo unto you, go unto the marijuana.
Well, no, but I mean, it is a natural, it is a, I mean, I hate that word natural when it comes to things like this, medicinal and whatever, but, it is a plant. We have not really, I mean, it is a plant, right? And I mean, of course, the argument, the counter argument to that, of course, is, like
So is opium.
Yeah, so is
Right?
opium, so is any other host of poisons that are terrible for you. It doesn't mean that you should take them in. It just because, they were made naturally, let's say, it does not necessarily mean they aren't dangerous for you. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but
grizzly bears are
even-
natural. Like,
Even beyond grizzly bears are natural.
It's
You don't
true,
see
I
me
mean-
smoking it. You don't see me smoking the grizzly. But even beyond it being natural or being religious affiliated or political affiliated, there's a lot of money backing marijuana and the legalization of marijuana.
Well,
I
and
mean, that's why I think it is a simple inevitability at some point. Is you've got so much revenue that could come out of that. You've got, again, like the jobs alone from legalizing cannabis worldwide would increase. I'm looking at a number here that says, again, the same study that quotes what the tax revenue would be, 782,000 additional jobs.
see, but I would actually like to push back on that a little bit. So, first off, let's start off by talking about, I guess, what are the big myths that we've all heard about. So, first off, for this episode, I listened to a lot of podcasts that by their title or their cover art, I thought would be very, basically would tell me that natural oils could cure all my illnesses.
Okay.
I guess is a way to describe it, right? And I also watched a lot of YouTube videos. I tried watching some documentaries on Netflix that I found to be, I'm not even going to say their name, but I found them to be very boring. And then I also tried to look at real scientific research and find some really good stuff. And actually, there are some really wonderful podcasts out there on this topic that I just wanted to kind of name drop really quick. Name drop. It's the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health podcast. It's not like they don't need a name drop from us, but they have
to feel the mad scientist bump their Harvard.
telling you,
You're welcome.
they have a wonderful, the Forum podcast in particular is a really great podcast if you are into questions of public health, and they had a really good episode on the latest findings on marijuana for medicine, for legalization efforts and all that stuff. They talked to someone from Colorado specifically in the area of public health, talking about what were their challenges, and then also about some of the myths or some of the ideas that were out there. Now, so I would say, let's
and
name
that's
off.
good. I'm glad you did all that research. How I went about this is I just smoked some pot.
Oh goodness.
Oh my God, no. No, I actually didn't. I wouldn't even know where to get it, even though now it is legal here, technically.
Yeah. So, so there are, I would say, a couple of big myths. The first one is that CBD oil is a health cure-all, right? That CBD oil, that marijuana, that THC, that any of these kind of things that come from marijuana legalization can only be good, or right, that they will be able to cure all these different things. It's a wonder drug. It's whatever. We've had that before with other things. Cocaine was at one time thought to be a wonder drug. So was opium.
They're still wonder drugs, but they're not good for you.
No, they're wonder drugs in a kind of way, I guess.
Wonder drugs. Yeah.
Right. So that was kind of one of the big ones that kept coming up. Another one was that they're not harmful at all, no matter how you take them or how you do them or at what age you start. That's also not really borne out by the data. It's kind of either way, but that's some stuff that we're going to talk about here a little bit too. Another one really is that it can actually be that it has no use. That was another one that came up a lot. So there was a lot of this debate is very polarized, I should say, where on the one hand you have folks that say, well, it hasn't been shown to be good for anything. All pot does is turn you into a smelly hippie who, whatever, hangs out on the weekends and doesn't do anything. Right? Yeah, you listen to Fish.
Living in your mom's basement.
Right? Like, there is that viewpoint, and that's completely not true. But then there's also the other side, which is that you can't possibly become addicted to it. And that's in some ways true depending on how you define addiction, but you know, you can become addicted to anything, right? It's more about your brain's reward center. You know, if you can become, you know, you can be addicted to sex, you become addicted to food, you become addicted to all kinds of weird stuff, right? And
Pokemon.
so well, really, video games is one too, where people can legitimately become addicted. It just depends on how you define it. You can't become chemically dependent on marijuana, right? Which is different than heroin or say, you know, opium or anything.
Oxycontin,
right.
Yeah, all that stuff.
You won't go into withdrawals because you haven't smoked weed in a week, but you can become dependent on that feeling.
And you will get really grouchy.
Well, that's part of it, honestly, right?
Sorry. Yes.
The other one is that we should treat it like treat it like cigarettes or alcohol. That was actually a really interesting one that came up in the Harvard podcast, especially, where I had never really thought of it that way, but that was a myth that they really were kind of hitting home hard on. And then the other one, Marie, the other big one, I think, is that the fact that we can make money off of it should be a positive argument for it.
Oh, I'm not saying it's positive or negative. I'm saying it's inevitable because people like money.
Well, so let's get into let's get into that one first, I guess, right? So for listeners that don't necessarily know exactly what we're talking about here. So there is a large debate in America right now, in particular, and I mean across the world really, about whether or not marijuana or its constitutive parts of the marijuana plant, you know, chemicals that you can get, compounds from the marijuana plant, such as CBD, such as THC, should become legalized in some way, or if they should be kept illegal, right? And so CBD is cannabidiol, or cannabidiol is the real way to say it, and then THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. THC is the compound in marijuana. It is the part of marijuana that makes you high. It's psychoactive, right? That is the active ingredient that if you smoke marijuana that you bought from, you know, some guy at the corner store, that is what's going to get you high.
$14, little man.
Exactly.
Put the money in my hand. Sorry.
CBD is the most well-known of 113 different cannabinoids, which have been found in cannabis, which is marijuana, another name for marijuana. And specifically, it is so in CBD is 40% of marijuana's kind of the extract that you get from marijuana. It is not intoxicating in any way, but it's thought to have. That's the one that's really thought to be useful. That one and THC are thought to be the useful ones for different medicinal uses. Right?
Yeah.
Now, the problem in the United States has been for a long time, and still is really, that marijuana is scheduled, it's a Schedule 1 drug. Okay? So, Schedule 1 are drugs. This is from DEA.gov. Schedule 1 drugs, substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Some examples of Schedule 1 drugs are heroin, LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, methaqualone, and peyote. Two of those things you can find growing.
Now that's a party.
the other ones you can't. Some other ones are, so Schedule 2 drugs, substances or chemicals are defined as drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. These drugs are also considered dangerous. Some example of Schedule 2 drugs are hydrocodone, so Vicodin, cocaine, methamphetamine, methadone, Dilaudid, Demerol, OxyContin, fentanyl, Dexedrine, Adderall, Ritalin. And then Schedule 3 drugs are things like Tylenol and codeine, or Tylenol with codeine, ketamine, steroids, testosterone. Schedule 4 drugs are things like Xanax, Soma, Valium. You know, so they have a low potential for abuse, but
basically everything that you'd find in your stepmother's medicine cabinet.
Pretty much, yeah. And then Schedule 5 are things that have a lower potential for abuse, but could still have narcotics in them. So anything in those higher levels. So that's stuff like Lomotil and Modafinil, Lyrica, it's stuff that you probably have never heard of even. Now, the issue here is that Schedule 1 drugs cannot be tested on. You cannot test them in a lab even. You have to get them from... so what I mean by testing in a lab is you cannot administer Schedule 1 drugs. It's very, very hard to get approval to run a test that administers Schedule 1 drugs to humans. So it is...
And why would you even want to do that in the first place?
Well, I mean...
Why do you want to test them?
LSD for MK Ultra, I guess.
Well, yes. Well, yeah.
But I know what you're saying.
That's the
though.
outlier.
I know what you're saying though. That it's very difficult to what's the word? Like normally you would not think about like, well, why the hell would you want to, right?
Well, I'm asking you wouldn't want to because if you're going to legalize something or if you're going to try and find the medical benefits, you have to be able to really closely understand and regulate the source of what you're doing, right? In a lot of ways.
Say that again.
So if you are going into the FDA and you're like, hey, we want to legalize this. This is actually now medicinal, where this is going to be treating people. You have to be able to show the clinical benefits of it. To show the clinical benefits of something, you need to be able to test it on people, right? And for marijuana, for you to be able to test it on somebody, you actually have to get it from a source that's not legal.
Right.
Get it from Jay and Silent Bob type characters hanging outside of Circle K.
Okay, I get what you're saying now. Yeah. So yeah, that is actually a huge part of the problem. So for instance, this is from an NPR article here called "Medical Marijuana's Catch-22: Limits on Research Hinder Patient Relief" from Marissa Taylor and Melissa Bailey. So the quote here is, quote, "Only one federal government contractor grows marijuana for federally funded research. Researchers complain the pot grown by a contractor at the University of Mississippi is inadequate for high-quality studies. The marijuana, which comes in a micronized powder form, is less potent than the pot offered at dispensaries, researchers say. It also differs from other products offered at dispensaries, such as so-called edibles that are eaten like snacks. The difference makes it difficult to compare the real-life effects of the marijuana compounds," end quote. Now, it is...
Can we just stop for a second and appreciate that argument and what that argument is? Because that's pretty funny. If you're just stepping back and looking at it, that's pretty hysterical. Like, basically, scientists are like, this is bunkweed.
I mean, but it's completely true, though, right? Like, if you were studying the effect of... If you were trying to study the effect of the toxicity of acetaminophen on humans or something, you would not give them Tylenol. Right, like you would not give them, or rather, let me say this. If you were trying to tell the effects of a specific drug on the populace, you would want it to be administered in the way...
drug. Yeah.
Well, you would want it administered in the way that people actually use it and in the doses they actually use it, right? Like, dosage matters extremely. So who cares if this... So I looked into this a little bit more. The marijuana grown at this University of Mississippi... at this contractor, basically, it's only something like 17 to like 25% potent, like in terms of THC.
That's some weak ass shit.
Well, it's actually far stronger than what was available in the 80s, where it was like 7 to 17% was like super high grade stuff. Right? Today, you can get products that are like 80% pure.
Yeah.
Right? So
80%
THC, and so that level of potency has with it a drastic difference potentially in the way it makes you act. So this is actually a huge problem, and
it's still kind of funny.
It is still kind of funny, but it's a huge issue.
It's not only that, but it's so incredibly uninteresting too. It's in a powder form. They're like, here it is. It's in a powder form for your testing.
Well, they have to make it...
We would recommend that you would only... it's like, way to take the fun out of it.
I think they specifically need... I think they need to make it like as not fun as possible, Marie.
I know, but that is also... But again, that is counterintuitive to the usage of it. Right?
Sure.
I mean, if somebody's going to be eating gummy bears with marijuana in them, that is what you should be testing it for.
100%.
That is the form factor of how it is being ingested into people has a lot to do with the dosage and how much they're going to take and how it's being marketed and sold, which are concerns of the FDA.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, like, they way to take the fun out of it.
Oh,
Federal
for sure.
government.
Now, here's a huge problem though, right? So I think we can kind of say for sure that it let's say off the bat, it has been shown, medical marijuana has been shown to be useful for the treatment of a number of different things. So specifically, the most evidence is that it's useful for the reduction of chronic pain in light of, say, other options like OxyContin and oxycodone and more dangerous opiates, right? So,
Yes.
And also marijuana, there is some evidence to show so far that it can be useful in actually treating opiate addiction by basically almost substituting something bad for you that's addictive with something that's like, still giving you some pain reduction, but is not addictive. Right. So, but again, you can still become acclimated or used to the feeling of being high. Right. So I want to be careful with the distinction between chemical addiction and like mental dependence, I guess. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
Because
but
you're taking marijuana, to your point before, is not chemically addictive.
no, but it's also though not, it just like anything else, you can become used to it and therefore
Yes.
it can start to
It's
interfere in
habit
your life.
forming.
Right.
Yes.
So it is though used to treat things for which there is no evidence that it's useful yet, right? So, for instance, Crohn's disease, mental health conditions like schizophrenia and PTSD in particular are very, very, what's the word? I guess are very, very controversial. Still, there is no real evidence to show that they're actually useful for those conditions.
Yeah, I
But-
would question schizophrenia pretty
Well,
hard.
honestly, I can say from personal experience that I have been told by doctors specifically that marijuana is very, very bad for anxiety disorders because it heightens your sense of anxiety once you're normal again. So once the high wears off, your anxiety level spikes, right? So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, if you're going to do it recreationally, that can be a big problem for you potentially. But again, of course, like with anything, it depends on the person, of course, right? But the argument is there still that there is no real evidence to date to suggest, at least not a big body of evidence to suggest that it's actually useful in the treatment of these things. However, it has been shown to be useful for things like chemotherapy side effects. In particular, that's been one of its most useful aspects, actually, is stopping the nausea and vomiting from chemotherapy, and also spasticity or tight or stiff muscles from multiple sclerosis. So it has a lot of use in different things. So in terms of its research itself, it's interesting. And parts of, again, these cannabinoids have been actually found to be useful for other things. So for instance, there's a research paper from MIT that suggested that it could be potentially useful in treating cancer. There have been research that has shown that it could be potentially useful in the treatment of things like bacterial infections. It might be antibacterial or antimicrobial. But again, all of those are just claims. They have not really been vetted or proven to the point that we should be, in my opinion, the things that we should be. I think we should make marijuana legal for people to smoke and enjoy. I think, though, that we should be careful about what we're telling people it can cure them of, right? Like
Yes.
there has to be more research. And ultimately, too,
Agreed.
before we legalize it for everyone, before we make it super available to say, I don't think anyone wants it to be made available to kids, right? But that is also an important step, though, in this process of legalization that a lot of people kind of forget about, right? Is the effects. Okay, so one of the other big, I think, I don't know if it's myth necessarily. So one thing that often comes up in the argument for why marijuana should be legalized or why medicinal marijuana should be legalized is that we should treat it like, or it's not as dangerous as cigarettes and alcohol, right? And actually, I heard a really interesting one. So in looking for this stuff, I found myself on a lot of like Christian websites or evangelical websites and stuff, and really they are pushing so hard the idea like reefer madness is still a thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's really fascinating to me. And one of the things I found was specifically that marijuana is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than alcohol or tobacco, was their argument.
Ooh.
And the argument basically was that because marijuana is psychoactive, if you smoke it, or if marijuana, the plant itself with THC in it, is psychoactive, because of that, it is more dangerous than, say, alcohol, which just, is a depressant, and in cigarettes, which you get no apparent psychoactive properties from, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of
crippling addiction.
I was going to say, it's kind of a funny argument. It's like, well, all cigarettes do is kill you, so those should be legal.
They just give you cancer.
It's crazy. But then actually that argument is stupid and ridiculous. And then, though, listening and reading some of the more serious considerations of the subject, some of the points that were made, I think, are actually quite interesting and valid, frankly. Which is it's the interplay between this idea that we have learned a lot from, say, cigarettes. Cigarettes are the most apt analogy, right? Alcohol is kind of an okay analogy if you think about, say, driving a car and being impaired and whatever, right? But even that is kind of fraught with some challenges. It was actually quite interesting. One of the study authors that was specifically on the Harvard podcast was saying that she actually, in their research, they had found that actually it was more likely for someone who had taken alcohol before driving to become more reckless and drive faster and think that they were, basically take more risks. Whereas if you smoked marijuana and then drove, you were more likely to become a danger because you were driving too slowly. That like you literally would slow down because you basically
become a grandma because you're all like, shit.
Well, kind of. So basically the argument is that alcohol makes you not realize how impaired you are. It's one of the kind of side effects. Whereas with marijuana, it makes you are aware how impaired you are. And so you become a danger. Yeah. Basically you start driving like grandma, right?
Well, but in either situation, I mean, it's sort of the extreme. You shouldn't be in a car if you've been drinking.
No, 100%.
Smoking.
100%.
Right?
But
it's almost like, I don't want to say a moot argument, but their argument is already invalid because what you're doing is illegal.
It's a straw man. It's a stupid argument. No one who thinks that, I don't think anyone sensible who thinks that marijuana should be legal thinks you should be allowed to drive after smoking, right? Like there's no way you should be allowed to watch It's Always Sunny, but you should not be allowed to drive.
You should be watching like 27 seasons of It's Always Sunny.
Can't wait. The other interesting thing that they had brought up though was the idea that it's never harmful to smoke it, or that because it isn't addictive, or because it's good for as a medicine, it is therefore not harmful to use recreationally at all. That was kind of the way that the argument was phrased, which was that it's the same argument that people used to make for things like OxyContin, right? It's medicine. Yeah. A doctor gave it to me. There's no way I could be misusing this thing if I just take a bunch of it, right? So the argument was sort of that there's a couple of interrelated issues. There's the issue of, say, pesticides, which is actually a much bigger question than I realized, which is because there is no federal regulation on the growing and distribution of marijuana. Some of the pesticides that can be used in certain areas, if it is not controlled, can actually be quite deadly for you if you're smoking it, right? Because you're introducing it to flame, and so then it can actually decompose and become all kinds of bad things for you, right? Mm-hmm. Another point was that actually some of the same kinds of tricks that the cigarette industry, or tobacco industry, I should say, used to market cigarettes to children are already being used to market marijuana to children as well. So things like a street advertisement for marijuana, you're not allowed to have, like, you're allowed to have like a tobacco shop, right? But you're not allowed to have, you're not really supposed to have things like, flashy lights and cool colors and be like, hey, come in. You know what I mean? Like, it's supposed to be
you can't
more
have
muted.
Toy cigarettes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But marijuana is marketed to kids. I mean, you can go to Spencer's and buy, pajama pants with weed things on them, and right, like that.
Yeah, I'm gonna argue against that though. Just because you can buy pajamas with weed on it doesn't necessarily. I mean, isn't that? I don't know. That's sort of a slippery slope argument, right? Like, that's saying that is indicative of future use.
No. I think what they were saying was that just like we took, just like you couldn't see Fred Flintstone smoking a cigarette anymore.
Yes.
Right? We should if we're going to legalize marijuana, we should still have public health methods in place to limit children's use of it. And part of that might be making it less accessible in terms of like a cool thing, you know what I mean? Like demystifying it in some way. And basically the argument was, I'm with you though, that the best way to get a kid to not want to smoke marijuana, or the best way to get a kid to not want to have a beer, is to let them drink a beer. Right? And they're going to be like,
transparently market to them. So you'd be like, we are now marketing to you, fun teenager. Cause they'll be like, yeah, no. I think the thing too is like, this argument that you're putting forward to me is just almost more fodder for why it should be regulated. That why it should be federally regulated, right?
100%.
Like when you're talking about pesticides, when you're talking about what is the dosage and the usage and how do we test and how do we navigate to understand its medicinal use, or even how do we treat it recreationally but make sure it's marketed appropriately, then all of that sets up that it should be federally. There should be oversight.
Right. Well, that was the fascinating thing, was that you had this argument coming from this one podcast that was from this reputable place on public health, and they were saying exactly what you're saying, right? Which was these things should make us want to regulate it because people aren't going to stop smoking pot, right?
Nope.
Like they're not going to stop smoking it, so we better regulate it.
And now the states are approving it for recreational use. And so then genie's out of the bottle at this point.
Right. But then you had not another podcast. I keep saying podcast because that's what we're on. Mm-hmm. Another source basically that was saying the opposite, that those facts mean that we should make it illegal because it's totally unsafe. I think it's very interesting, the dichotomy there. Actually that was one of the problems they were bringing up, Marie, was that because it is states that are making it legal but not the federal government, now states that have never, like, the states currently have nothing at all to do with regulation of pesticides or ensuring that products that go to sale at market for ingestion are safe. That's all the FDA and the EPA, right? Or vice versa, the EPA and the FDA.
Yes.
Right. And because that infrastructure is not in place at the state level, it was really interesting hearing them say that's one of their biggest challenges now is if we're going to let all these people grow marijuana and sell it at distributors at, different places and stuff, then we now basically the states need to create that infrastructure themselves. So it was, I think, very interesting.
But and that even sets up like state versus state issues. So let's pretend as for an argument, you have a grow field in one state and they are using a pesticide and they are using a drainage system and irrigation that goes into the water that goes into the next state that is somehow affecting the crops or whatever it is in the next state, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like whatever you're doing in one state is not going to hold in one state insofar as what the possible side effects.
No, I mean
it's that growth.
It's exactly why the EPA was started, right? It was because you could have a state that had really stringent regulations, and then you could just go dump your toxic waste in, wherever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think another really interesting though myth that is brought up a lot is again that same sense of like, well, there's so many jobs that could be created. There's so many things that could be happening around this or whatever. To me, actually, that almost misses the point of, like, we could also make a lot of jobs if we made heroin legal. Do you know what I mean? Like we could, and not, again, I'm playing devil's advocate, there is just no comparison between heroin and marijuana, right?
I was gonna say, nice jump. Go
But
for the jump.
I know, seriously,
Three pointer on that one.
But you know what I mean? That we could make, like, the idea or the question of, can you make money off of it, or just because industry wants it to happen, it's a good thing. I think people are using that argument in this case because it's something that they want. But if it was, say, industry wanting to legalize, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Let's take, for example, like GMO crops, right? It's the same kind of industry. It's another thing where they're like, you should remove the regulation so we can start doing it, yada, yada, whatever. The question is not whether or not you can make money. The question is whether or not it's healthy. Is it a good thing? Is it good for the public health, right? So to me, the argument of whether or not it's better for the public health for medical marijuana, at least, to be legalized, I think there's no question. I think that's completely true. I think at the same time, the question of should recreational marijuana be legal with, of course, control and stipulation and whatever, I think that's also kind of been answered already too, in that, yeah, why the heck not, right? But at the same time, there are these other, like, it is a bigger problem than people realize of just, like, legalize it, man. Like, it is not that simple at all.
No, again, like, it's why I would argue for federal oversight. Because if you are, let's say you are going to, let's take the opposite argument and say it would be good because it would create jobs, right? It would create all sorts of jobs insofar as growing and, STEM jobs and supply chain jobs and storage and storefronts and alternative usage and all this other stuff. But that doesn't mean that those jobs would, again, you would have to have a certain amount of oversight in that as well, like you would have hypothetically in how you produce alcohol or how you produce firearms, hypothetically, or how you produce cigarettes.
Right. And that was actually another whole argument that I think, so the process of making very high potency products, so things like vaporizing pens or rather cartridges that go into vape pens and stuff like that, that process is also very, it's not challenging. Like it's chemically, it's not challenging really. What is challenging is finding ways to do it that would be approved, let's say, by the FDA if the FDA ever did step in, right? Because, I mean, so, for example, one of the easiest ways to do basically like an extraction of a organic compound from another organic compound is liquid extraction. So, especially with plants and stuff, you would mash up the plant basically with like a mortar and pestle or something, and then you would use some organic solvent to separate one component from the other components out, right? And in that way, like you could
acetate or something like that.
Kind of, right? So it just so happens that one of the compounds that is used for that in the marijuana industry are hexenes and cyclohexenes and things like that are really bad for you, especially if you inhale them. Right? And so if there is no federal oversight going on, and you're just, you're ingesting basically components of, nail polish, right? And varnish, that kind of stuff. It's not great for you, right? And so
great for you. Yeah. It's not that natural high you were going for.
No, again, it has that problem of, well, we want to make it again, the overall problem, I think, is like we keep getting back to, if we made it legal federally, we could regulate it better. And there does not really seem to be, outside of the same downsides that other things that are already legal have, there does not really seem to be the same amount of downside. And in fact, in some cases, more upside in its use for, medicine and other kind of uses.
And it being taxable. Like,
yeah.
I don't mean to be the sheer capitalist, but it's like, yeah, if you run it through the federal government, if it's federally regulated, it's taxed as such. And you would generate more taxable, that is a lot of money. And I think anyone who's seeing sort of 10 years from now, what 10 years from now within this industry looks like, and sort of the sheer ability of of how much money could be made from it, that's already happening. That's already coming to fruition with lobbying groups, with think tanks that are putting out data on this, with pharmaceuticals that will start advocating for this versus something like an Oxycontin, and then take it into commercial distribution for recreational use. I mean, there's too much money behind it for it not to happen, is how I kind of, not that it's a justification, but there's just, when it has that much impetus behind it, there's not a lot of things that turn that off. And if you decide like, okay, we're going to make it illegal, straight illegal again, then it becomes a state versus federal fight. And then even if the federal wins in the states, they have to disband it, it's not going to go away.
No.
Right.
So another, I think, part of this question kind of, so again, I kind of want to get into the question of, so we have this big marijuana industry kind of, currently we have it kind of on a chain, right? It's being held back from explosive growth, let's say.
Big weed.
What exactly? What stops it from becoming another tobacco industry? Right? What stops it from becoming another NRA? What stops it from becoming another
nothing, really.
Nothing, right? And so that I think
nothing.
is another I think that is another very useful argument or interesting argument, right? So one point that was brought up was that they're now starting to add menthol to marijuana cigarettes in some states, right?
I can imagine, yeah.
Which is a known tactic to make it more palatable, especially to younger users, right? It is they're starting to package it in ways that make it look appetizing, right? To make it look cool,
minty, fresh weed.
Its use, I mean, its use in edibles makes it extremely available to kids, right? Thankfully, tobacco tastes like total crap, right? Yeah. But it is, I think, again, one of those areas where, its use in, say, dispensaries, or maybe not dispensaries, almost like bars, right? A marijuana bar, a weed bar, whatever. Mm-hmm. That might be a more viable option for a place where you can get edibles than, say, being able to buy them and then bring them home. Like, you should be able to make them at home. That's fine, whatever, right? But I think it comes down to a question of, or I think for a lot of people, what the question is, or what the issue is, ultimately, is that it can get into the hands of children. And for kids especially, so that was one other point, I think, that a big myth that is out there is that it's not dangerous at any age, right? That babies should be, babies can be around secondhand smoke and whatever. It's not going to do anything. You're still, first off, you're still smoking something, right? You're still burning something and getting particulate ash into your lungs. That's not good for you, right? Like, it doesn't
particulate.
You're not.
You make it sound so good.
You're maybe not.
Hickory.
I mean, it's not necessarily as bad, say, as cigarettes yet. But if the marijuana industry comes to fruition, I think it's a very good bet to think that what they're going to try to do is innovate to make their strains or their cigarettes or whatever last longer, right? The same kind of stuff that caused the cigarette industry, or the tobacco industry rather, to start adding carcinogens to tobacco products, right? Like, all of that same stuff could happen. And so I think a really interesting and smart approach would be use those lessons we've learned from tobacco, because just because weed isn't dangerous now because you can grow it in your backyard and make your own stuff doesn't mean it won't be dangerous in 10 years when, a big ass company has decided to get in on the game and is, selling weed cigarettes with, I don't know, Josie Camel on the thing, right? Like,
well, God love you for, first of all, thinking that we're going to learn from our mistakes.
I know. I know.
Right?
Never, ever,
Especially
ever.
something with like tobacco. God love you for that. I mean, I don't know. I think that they have to look at practical ways that they can put regulation in effect that will at least gives on the very first pass transparency to the consumer, right?
100%.
So if
100%.
if it's a consumable item and you can eat it, there should be very closely, regulated amounts in that consumable that is known to the public. So all of this stuff should be very transparent to the public on the first pass, because I just feel like we are not a species that's really big on or very motivated to learn from epic failures
No,
quickly, right?
And the thing
Like,
is too, like the history.
we're still rounding out like the dinosaurs and
Right.
sort of the mass extinction event. We're like, oh, okay, that's starting to make sense. All right, but like tobacco, come on, man, that's way too soon. But it's like I think if you can almost as the consumer, like consumer watchdogs, should be really up on this and really much more advocates for what's going to happen next, and lobbying groups, because that's where the money's at, right? It's like they're in lobbyists. There's people out there that are going to start to again recognize this as revenue, as a way to make money, and are going to start to put money against making that money on in the courts and in Congress and in the Senate and things along that. So that's where I would think you would have to start to pay more attention to.
Yeah, and I think another interesting analogy to this would be like the regulation of food and drugs before we had an FDA, right? I mean, people are not particularly good at picking what goes into their bodies, right? Especially if you're in a situation where you're, I don't know if coerced isn't really the right word, but if you're living on a very fixed income, you might buy that meat that looks like it's been spray painted pink, right? Because, it's all they got down at the butcher, right? I mean, really, it is definitely, I think, still an issue and a concern. And so, again, with this kind of thing, I think it's really important that we do it in a way. I mean, honestly, I think the first step in legalization is overturning convictions for drug-related offenses. Right?
Yes.
I mean, that seems like a crazy thing that we're going to make it, some guy who's gone to jail, who went to jail for having some weed on him, a third time 20 years ago is going to get out and get turned down at a weed cafe because he's got a conviction on his record. You know what I mean? Like, that's ridiculous.
Yes. There's a certain amount of sickening irony around that one.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And at the same time, though, I think that there are so many myths to marijuana where we have dispelled a lot in our society of the myths of like the reefer madness and stuff, right? Those are basically gone, but we're now starting to create, and that's what really has me worried, honestly, is that we're starting to create the opposite ones, just like we had for tobacco, where, come on, it's fine for you. There's nothing wrong with this, right? And in the case of, in the case of weed, like there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it doesn't do any harm if used recreationally and, responsibly and whatever. But honestly, in terms of its study of the negative health effects it can have on someone, like it's just not out there, man. I mean, we have no idea if smoking marijuana
effects,
for 30 years has the same rate of the increased incidence rate of lung cancer as smoking anything else.
No.
Right? Aside from looking at Willie Nelson, you know what I mean? Like there's no way of knowing. Cheech and Chong and Willie Nelson aren't enough of a sample size. We need more people.
Their sample size. They're the control group.
And the other thing.
That would be such a good band. You could get
such a great band.
You could get like Keith Richards, Willie Nelson, Snoop Dogg, and just call them control group.
We could call them the control group. That's hilarious. And
that's some good shit.
There's one other, I think, big myth that so this myth is almost too silly, I think, to even talk about, really. Well, not too silly to talk about.
It'd be really funny if we were high, but keep going.
It would be really funny if we were high. The big myth that comes up it's now again the same thing. This happens with every single somewhat chemically sounding thing that some idiot on the internet can mix up into a shake or a powder or a oil for themselves or something, is the use of CBD oil in all kinds of homeopathic medicine. Now, again, there is no evidence that so a recap for listeners. CBD is the non-psychoactive part of marijuana, or one of the non-psychoactive parts of marijuana.
It can be found in chemtrails.
Damn it, Marie. It has, but it is even less studied than marijuana, than THC containing marijuana. It is even less studied. So when I say that, there's very little evidence to support the idea that marijuana is good or bad either way, there's more to support that it's good for medicinal uses than that it's bad for you, but still, the evidence is not super duper strong, or the field is not super huge yet. There is even less evidence to say that CBD oil does anything for you. There's just nothing, right? There are some anecdotal tests. There are some tests to suggest that it is the CBD in the marijuana plant that has some of these medicinal effects. But in terms of it fixing you of your toxins or your gelins or your chemtrails or your exploding head syndrome or anything else, your headaches, your nausea, your whatever, all that other stuff, whatever, that is all anecdotal at this point. There's just no evidence for it. And really, I think one of the worst things for the legalization effort is going to be if homeopaths and stuff start to jump on this thing, because they have been so wrong about so many other things in the past that it's like, it's like if you find out that, you have the same position as the Nazi party on something, right? Like, it's like, damn it. You're like, crap, we can't support it anymore, right? Like,
so
the same.
I would love to have an episode or somebody come in and tell us what the homeopaths have been right on, right? Because that's what I'm sort of curious about. Because I think we do a lot of positioning on homeopaths that is counter.
I mean, a lot.
I think is justified, because I think a lot of the times that we brought up homeopathic medicine, there has not been the clinical study or the background that has said yes, it's effective. My curiosity is like, when is it effective? Is it effective?
I think the arguments that would be made are that it was homeopathic medicine was the starting of pharmaceuticals.
But now, right? Like,
well, that's the thing, though.
I don't chew bark anymore when I want to take an aspirin. I take an aspirin, right? So
I think that all of their proofs are going to be times where science has proven homeopathic pharmacology correct. And then at that point,
I take the actual pharmaceutical.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Point, right?
That's what I'm saying, though, is that at that point, though, it stops being homeopathic medicine by definition. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you could, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are.
I'm saying chew the bark instead of take the aspirin, right?
Well, there's for instance, there is the leaf of the cocoa plant that basically contains cocaine in it that is chewed in, I think, Peru, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that. It's chewed, though, in the country where it comes from, and maybe Colombia too. But it's basically
you still shouldn't drive.
Well, but no, but basically it's chewed, and it's almost used like a chewing gum, kind of like a chewing leaf, and it basically it can cure headaches and stuff and toothaches. But it's because it is a pain reliever, right? Like, the active chemical in that plant is a pain reliever.
Right.
It's not. But I doubt very much. Like, they're never going to be able to point to a case where I don't know, it did something that science couldn't measure, right? That's the problem.
An interesting challenge for this little podcast we're on is to actually bring on somebody who is a homeopath.
I think it'd be very interesting. I mean, I know people.
Some of my best friends are homeopaths.
No. I know people who do practice I know people who do practice homeopathic medicine on
My mom.
themselves.
Ooh, we could have my mom on. Ooh, that
Dude,
would
my
be
mom,
so-
my mom
that would-
too. Honestly, in some cases,
Oh,
right?
we could have the moms. That would be quite the show. That would be the last show. That would be going out on the high notes.
the moms.
The mom.
Anyways, dear listeners, that is it for this episode on Marijuana Myths Part 2. I think we covered it all, right? We
Yeah,
feel like
man.
we covered it all, Marie.
I think we cashed it.
We cashed it. Our next episode is going to be on. So we actually have a bonus episode coming out soon, which I think you're going to really enjoy, which will be a lot of fun. And then we are going to do our next series
Plug
on
it, fat boy.
sexism, on sexism in science. Plug it, fat boy. Our next episode will be on sexism in science, and especially in academic science. We're going to be talking about, a case here in Minnesota, at the University of Minnesota, that we actually had the good fortune of being able to interview the reporter who broke that story, which is going to be really cool. And then after that, after sexism in science, Marie, we got economic collapse
Oh, shit.
coming up.
Just another little light topic.
Another light topic. It's going to be great.
Jeez, man.
If you haven't yet, like the show on iTunes, review us, subscribe, please. It's great. Every little bit helps us so much. Join the Facebook group, which is becoming a lot of fun. Actually, Des today posted a really good topic, which was what episode do you want to see in the future? And we got some really good suggestions on there. Very, very excited about that. And
Chemtrails Part 2.
Chemtrails Part 2 with Marie. And of course, any questions or comments, you can reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Mad Scientist Pod. Marie is at Team Giant Squid. And our email is themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. And if you haven't yet, go listen to Marie's podcast, Whatever Remains. It's amazing. It's super good.
Ooh, and we should have episode 2, Elimination by Illumination, coming out within a few days.
Damn,
Knock
that's a
on
good
wood.
title.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yes. It's gonna be
All
fun.
right, Marie.
All right, sir. I am going to go. I'm going to go snort some cinnamon. And
Good times.
teasing. Thank you very much, dear listeners.
Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist Podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mad Scientist Pod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see. If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Yes, we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.